is Elise Delon Van Adler. I've been living here for 5 years, alone. My husband's job keeps him traveling all the time. I can't travel with him because I'm not well.
Welcome to episode 52 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are heading to New York in search of missing sisters and finding ourselves in a whole heap of trouble with the powers of darkness. First up, we have The Seventh Victim from 1943 and producer Val Lewton, and this was directed by Mark Robson, and not, as I've been calling him for this entire series, Mark Robson. Yes, it's Dana Andrews all over again, but in my defence, it does look like Robson when it's written down. This stars Kim Hunter, Jean Brooks, Tom Conway and Isabel Jewell, and its inclusion in this week's episode does, very sadly, bring us ever closer to the end of the Lewton horror series. Then we are following this with Inferno from Dario Argento and 1980. This was his follow-up to 1977's Suspiria and was the movie in which he fully introduced the idea of the three mothers, three supernatural beings inspired by the writings of Thomas de Quincey. This stars Leigh McCloskey, Irene Miracle, Eleonora Giorgi, Daria Nicolodi and Gabriele Lavia. Along the way we'll be discussing the actors Kim Hunter and Daria Nicolodi and falling down some very esoteric rabbit holes, including satanic conspiracies involving the Freemasons, the works and disappearance of the alchemist Fulcanelli, and the arcane world of actor, artist, and self-described visual philosopher Leigh J. McCloskey. But before we do anything else, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used in preparing this week's episode, and as usual, all sources used will be listed or linked in the show notes. So, when discussing The Seventh Victim, I have referred to the books Val Lewton, The Reality of Terror by Joel E. Siegel, Dreams of Darkness by J. Peter Lott, and Icons of Grief, Val Lewton's Homefront Pictures by Alexander Nemerov. I have also referred to commentaries and extras on the Blu-ray release of the film from Criterion, and articles on the websites bfi.org.uk and brightlightsfilm.com. And when discussing Inferno, I have referred to Dario Argento's autobiography, Fear, and the books Dario Argento, The Man, the Myths and the Magic by Alan Jones, Broken Mirrors, Broken Minds, The Dark Dreams of Dario Argento by Maitland McDonough, Art of Darkness, The Cinema of Dario Argento, edited by Chris Gallant, and Spaghetti Nightmares, edited by Luca M. Palmarini and Getto Mistretta. And we're going to get into our first film of the week straight away with this episode, which is, of course, The Seventh Victim, produced by Val Lewton and directed by Mark Robson. It stars Kim Hunter, Jean Brooks, Tom Conway and Isabel Jewell. And we're also going to be getting straight into the spoilers, so as always, if you have yet to see the movie, now is the time to hit pause and return once you have. And just as an added warning, there is also going to be a major spoiler for 1942's Cat People as well. The Seventh Victim is the fourth film to come from Val Lewton's horror unit at RKO Studios, and the first without director Jacques Tourneur. After completing The Leopard Man, RKO broke up the partnership, figuring that as they had worked so well together and had made very successful films, then logically they would work twice as well when apart and make twice as many successful movies. Yep, I don't really get the logic either. Tourneur was promoted to directing A-list pictures, the first of which was Days of Glory starring Gregory Peck and released in 1944. Sadly, it was not successful critically or commercially, and Tourneur would later go on to say that he regretted the separation from his producing partner. Quote, We had a perfect collaboration. Val was the dreamer, the idealist, and I was the materialist, the realist. We should have gone right on doing bigger, more ambitious pictures and not just horror movies." End quote. With Tourneur gone, Lewton needed to find a new director for the next film on the unit's roster and decided to offer the opportunity to Mark Robson. Robson had been working in the horror unit as an editor and had edited Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie, and The Leopard Man. So he fully understood what it was that the unit was trying to achieve, and Lewton also had a very paternal affection for him. In a letter that Lewton wrote to his mother, he said of this, quote, "I gave the job of direction of the seventh victim to the young cutter who did the editorial work on the other pictures, Mark Robson, and he's doing a beautiful job, almost as well as Jacques. And this makes me very happy, as I'm extremely fond of him." End quote. The title given by the studio for this next picture was indeed The Seventh Victim, and Lewton gave story writing duties to DeWitt Bodine, who had written the story for Cat People. But Bodine's story for The Seventh Victim, written as a literal story as opposed to a screenplay, was actually about as far from the finished film as it's possible to get. The only similarity between the two is that the central character is an orphaned girl named Mary. His story was set not in New York but in California, and has been described as a rather routine murder mystery, with the female protagonist marked as the potential seventh victim of a serial killer unless she can discover his identity first. This narrative is far closer to The Leopard Man than it is Cat People, or I Walked with a Zombie, and Lewton was less than keen. After submitting his story, Bodine was then sent to New York to research Washington Irving and Legends of Tarrytown, stories that would eventually find their way into 1944's Curse of the Cat People. While he was away, Lewton decided to scrap his story altogether and go in a different and incredibly daring direction. Instead of a film about a serial killer, he decided that he wanted to tell a story about Satanism. This was a very controversial subject at the time, particularly given that the Hays Production Code was still in full force. In addition, Lewton didn't want to distance his Satanists behind the tropes of Gothic castles and period settings. He wanted to set his in modern-day New York, anticipating Rosemary's Baby by over 2 decades. The story itself is rather complicated, certainly more so than Lewton's first 3 movies. A young girl named Mary travels to New York to find her missing sister. She is helped and hindered along the way by her sister's husband, a friendly poet, and her sister's psychiatrist, who may or may not be entirely trustworthy. As the story progresses, it transpires that her sister had been looking for meaning in her life, and consequentially had joined a secret satanic society. Unfortunately, the society now believe that she has betrayed them and are trying to track her down. With Bodine still in New York, Lewton brought in a new writer, Charles O'Neill, to begin working up the story, but he did call upon Bodine for additional research. He is alleged to have asked him to see if he could, quote, get to a devil-worshipping society meeting, end quote. Although this might seem to have been a rather tall order, particularly in the early 1940s, Bodine managed it, gaining access to a society of New York devil worshippers through contacts at RKO Studios. And you can probably add in your own jokes about Hollywood studios and Satanism in here. I'm not sure whether the group that he encountered on New York's West Side were actual devil worshippers or what we would now call witches or pagans, but they were certainly involved with something. Allowed to attend only as a silent and anonymous observer, Bodine later recalled, quote, "It was during the war, and I would have hated to be Hitler with all these spells they were working against him. They were mostly old people, and they were casting these spells while they knitted and crocheted. A bunch of tea-drinking old ladies and gentlemen sitting there muttering imprecations against Hitler. I made use of the experience in that the devil worshippers in the Seventh Victim were very ordinary people who had one basic flaw, an Achilles heel which had turned them against good and towards evil." End quote. Bodine returned to Los Angeles and began working on the new screenplay with O'Neill, and as we've heard, he used his encounter in New York as inspiration for the movie's satanic cult. The cult in the movie, who are less old people crocheting and more New York high society drinking cocktails, are called the Palladists. They are also, as Bodine said, people with a fundamental flaw that drove them towards evil, the bored, disaffected, and disappointed who have turned their failure and loneliness into a doctrine. But the name Palladist comes not from the imaginations of Lewton, Bodine, or O'Neill, but was instead inspired by a rather elaborate hoax from the 19th century, known as the Palladist conspiracy or the Taxil hoax. This was perpetrated by a French writer called Leo Taxil, and was intended to mock both the Catholic Church and the Freemasons, neither of whom he was particularly fond. In the 1880s, Taxil, who was famously anti-Catholic, faked a religious conversion to Catholicism, and over the following years published a 4-volume book denouncing Freemasonry, claiming that the organization was secretly worshipping Satan in a global cult which he called Palladism. In these books, Taxil fabricated eyewitness accounts from various fictional characters, and with each new volume, the stories became more and more outrageous. These included the Palladists taking direct orders from demons, including a snake which wrote prophecies on a woman's naked back, and a piano-playing crocodile. His ultimate goal was to dupe the Catholic Church into believing these accounts, and then to expose them as credulous and willing to believe in pretty much anything, while also taking potshots at the Freemasons, of whom he was also very critical. But even he was a little taken aback that anyone actually believed him, saying in a later interview, quote, "The public made me what I am, the arch liar of the period. For when I commenced to write against the Masons, my object was amusement, pure and simple. The crimes I laid at their door were so grotesque, so impossible, so wildly exaggerated, I thought everybody would see the joke and give me credit for originating a new line of humour. But my readers wouldn't have it so. They accepted my fables as gospel truth, and the more I lied for the purpose of showing I lied, the more convinced became they that I was a paragon of veracity. And then it dawned on me that there was lots of money in being a Munchausen of the right kind, and so for 12 years I gave it to them hot and strong, but never too hot." End quote. Taxil eventually came clean in 1897, but even though there had been many who doubted his stories all along, belief in the fictional Palladist cult did not entirely die away, and he certainly made a lasting impression. The hoax is still studied today as one of the most successful disinformation campaigns in history. Well, until the advent of social media, anyway. Although The Seventh Victim is nominally about Satanism, much as with all of Lewton's movies, it is less about that and more about its subtextual themes. These include loneliness, nihilism, the fact that every human being is essentially unknowable, and also, importantly and heavily coded, same-sex attraction. Of all of the Lewton movies, this is the most doom-laden, setting out its stall from the very opening shot, a stained glass window bearing a quote from the Holy Sonnets of John Donne. Quote, "I run to death, and death meets me as fast, and all my pleasures are like yesterday." End quote. Even Cat People, which closes with another John Donne quotation, barely comes close to the pessimism of this movie, which offers little hope for its characters and suggests that life is a series of disappointments and heartache that can only be resolved through death. It's a happy little film then. As regular listeners will know, although he worked with incredibly talented writers, Lewton was less of a producer and more of an auteur. On all of his films, he acted as an uncredited screenwriter, generating the ideas and adding in enormous amounts of detail to the final screenplays, including, for example, the John Donne quote that opens this film. It has been said that The Seventh Victim is his most personal production, and that he drew a great deal on his own emotional experience, particularly now that he and Tourneur had been separated by the studio. And perhaps part of the reason for its doom-laden and incredibly downbeat tone came from the interference of the studio itself, particularly how they had treated the partnership, and importantly, how they treated Lewton. While the story was still being developed, Lewton was called into RKO for a meeting with the studio execs to discuss the success of his first 3 productions. At this meeting, the executives told him that after the current schedule of films had been completed, he would be promoted to A-list producer status. Incredibly excited by the news, he immediately set about planning his first big-budget film and announced to the executives several weeks later the properties that he was considering. And at that meeting, he stated that he wanted Mark Robson to be the director of his first A feature. RKO executives were less than thrilled with the idea of trusting a major production to an untried director and gave Lewton an ultimatum. He could continue to work with Robson, or he could move onto the A-list. But he couldn't do both. A man of great loyalty to his team, Lewton refused the promotion, also realizing perhaps that the only way he could maintain creative control was to stay doing lower-budget pictures, films which, while profitable, didn't attract too much studio interference. Nevertheless, after all that he had done for RKO, effectively saving the studio more or less, this must have hurt. Unfortunately, though, his loyalty to his team was not ever really repaid. In fact, quite the opposite, given that Robson and fellow Lewton alum Robert Wise would cut the producer out of their independent film production company, Aspen Productions, in 1950. After the opening shot of John Donne's sonnet, we see a group of schoolgirls passing down a flight of stairs, while a solitary girl, Mary, climbs in the opposite direction. And this staircase will look very familiar to anyone who's seen Cat People. It is indeed the same staircase that we see inside Irina's apartment block, having been taken from the set of the 1942 Orson Welles movie, The Magnificent Ambersons. Mary is called in to see the headmistress, Mrs. Lowood, whose name has been taken from the girls' school in the novel Jane Eyre. In Charlotte Bronte's novel, Lowood's school is a grim, restrictive and harsh charity boarding school, and the use of the name here is a deliberate indicator to the headmistress's character. Mrs. Lowood is joined by Miss Gilchrist, a younger woman who looks at Mary with a combination of sorrow and compassion through the remainder of the scene. At this point, we learn that Mary is an orphan, and that her tuition, which has been paid for by her sister Jacqueline, has run out. No one knows where Jacqueline might be, and so, turning down Mrs. Lowood's not-so-generous offer to remain at the school as an unpaid assistant, Mary decides to head to New York to find her sister. And as she leaves Mrs. Lowood's office, Gilchrist takes her to one side and says, quote, "Mary, don't come back. No matter if you never find your sister, no matter what happens to you, don't come back. My parents died when I was a pupil. I left just as you are leaving, but I didn't have courage. One must have courage to live in the world. I came back." End quote. One can, of course, read this opening scene exactly as it is portrayed, with Gilchrist seeing in Mary the girl that she once was, and wanting her to avoid the fate that she now endures. However, for many retrospective viewers, there is far more to this scene and the dynamic between Lowood and Gilchrist than first appears. Many have seen their relationship, and the entire film itself, as a case of queer coding, with Gilchrist a passive feminine character paired with the more dominant headmistress, a pairing that we will also see later with the characters of Mrs. Reddy and Frances. Were this all there was, the claims of queer coding might be rather a stretch. However, as the narrative progresses, there are further hints, some of them not so subtle, that one of the other underpinning themes of the film is what was once termed the love that dare not speak its name. Several women in the story are more than a little obsessed with the missing Jacqueline. Mary meets a woman at a party who says that she knew Jacqueline intimately, and later in the narrative, young Frances will declare her love for Jacqueline as the Palladists try to drive her to take her own life. And then there is the character of Jacqueline herself, and what motivations may have driven her to seek a psychiatrist and also join the Palladists in the first place. For much of the movie, Jacqueline is absent, appearing very briefly and silently at the midway point before she vanishes again, only to reappear later. And so for the first half of the film, all we know of her is through the words of others, making her initially more of a construct than a character, an idea before she emerges as a person. And these recollections indicate, rather sadly, that to many of her friends and acquaintances, that is all Jacqueline is, an idea. We learn that she is very beautiful and that anyone who ever meets her never forgets her. Psychiatrist Dr. Judd describes her as a sensationalist, and Mr. and Mrs. Romari, who rent a room to her, only know her as the Bellissima Madonna. Gregory Ward, who we later discover is her husband, describes her through his emotional reactions to her more than anything else, saying, quote, "There is something exciting and unforgettable about her, something you never get hold of, something that keeps a man following after her." End quote. Even Mary, partway through her search, has to admit that even she doesn't know exactly who her sister is. This is a classic film noir technique, and something that we see in the films Laura, released in 1944, and Murder My Sweet, released the same year. In this case, the device also reinforces the idea of Jacqueline as a very lonely woman, while also underlining another theme of the movie, that we can never, ever really know who anyone is, even those to whom we are seemingly the closest. What we eventually infer is that this is a woman who has effectively been leading a double life. Outwardly, a respectable married woman with a successful business, but inwardly drawn into a secretive world beneath the surface of conventional society. On the surface level, this is a woman seeking to find meaning of any kind through arcane ritual, but it's not difficult to read this as further queer coding, particularly the need to conceal the self while seeking community and identity in marginal spaces. Back at the school, we see Mary making her way out into the world, her exit accompanied by more little touches from Lewton himself that are so subtle as to almost go unnoticed. As she leaves, the lessons being recited in the background are a repetition of the French verb for to search, a conjugation of the Latin to love, and a recitation of an Oliver Wendell Holmes poem, which includes a line about leaving thine outgrown shell by life's unresting sea. And if that doesn't sum up what follows, then I don't really know what does. We are now introduced to another strong, dominant woman in a film which is essentially a movie dominated by its female characters. We are in the laboratory of the beauty company La Sagesse, and this is Mrs. Reddy, who, as it turns out, purchased Jacqueline's business from her more than 8 months ago. After taking the opportunity to brag that she's doing rather well with the business, Mrs. Reddy confirms that she hasn't seen Jacqueline for months, saying, quote, "Your sister had many friends, but they were not my friends. I was only the manager of her plant." End quote. All of which we later discover to be quite untrue, of course. Mary is played by Kim Hunter, here making her screen debut aged 20, and owing a little more to Lewton than just casting her in the first place. Originally named Janet Cole, she had been discovered on stage in Pasadena by a scout for David O. Selznick, who arranged a screen test that was produced by Lewton and directed by Jacques Tourneur. But there's even more to it than that. Early in Lewton's career with Selznick, he had been asked to go and get comments from audience members during test screenings, and because he didn't really want to do it, he made all of the comments and all of the names up. And this was apparently quite obvious to Selznick, as when he decided that the name Janet Cole wouldn't really work for his new discovery, he sent her over to Lewton's office with the words, "I'm sending you to a man who's good at making up names." And sure enough, a few hours later, the name Kim Hunter was settled on. Hunter would go on to have a highly successful screen and stage career, including her role as Stella in the original stage production of A Streetcar Named Desire and in the 1951 film adaptation, for which she won both an Oscar and a Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actress. But it has to be said, though, that at times her performance in this film is a little bit awkward, something that stemmed from her inexperience in front of the camera. Because she was a stage actress, she was always being told to do less on screen, and this resulted in a rather stiff performance at points, saying, quote, "I found myself terrified to move a muscle. Every now and then Val would say, 'Would you relax, please? You look like you're embalmed.'" End quote. Lewton also barred her from seeing the dailies because she had responded poorly to seeing her initial screen test, and so it's possible that this intended act of kindness might also have contributed to the stiffness of her performance at certain points. And this is a shame, as the way that Mary is written on the page shows that she is far more complex than the average B-movie heroine. If nothing else, she is strong-willed and daring, travelling to New York alone, shaming the detective Irving August into venturing down a dark corridor and telling Gregory Ward not to give her orders. Admittedly, at least one of these examples is perhaps more foolhardy than courageous, and it does lead to Detective August's death, but they demonstrate her willfulness nonetheless. After a brief exchange with Francis, an employee at La Sagesse, Mary makes her way to a restaurant named, appropriately enough, Dante. This allows for an effective demonstration of the film's sound design, with the whirling sound of a barrel organ giving way to initial silence in the restaurant, and then to the singing of Bella Romari, who co-owns the restaurant with her husband Giacomo. Here, Mary asks the somewhat unlikely question as to whether the Romaris know her sister, which initially elicits the quite reasonable reply of how could they? This is a restaurant. But, as it turns out, Mary is quite correct when she says that anybody who sees Jacqueline never forgets her, as the two do know her, under the nickname of La Bellissima Madonna. What's more, they have also rented her a room, and after not a great deal of persuasion, they let Mary look inside, revealing nothing save for a hangman's noose and a chair. This scene tells us that not only are the Romaris not the most security-conscious of landlords, but also amplifies the idea of needing courage to live in the world. This room, we later learn, is what provides Jacqueline comfort from her worries, a space that she has returned to at least 3 times to remind herself that death is always an option, and that in death one might find release from all troubles. It's a remarkably downbeat reveal for an incredibly nihilistic theme, echoing the verse from John Donne and anticipating the eventual climax of the film. This scene also introduces us, albeit briefly, to Mimi, a consumptive woman also lodging in the rooms above the restaurant, whose presence is seen occasionally through the movie and more significantly in the film's harsh climax. She is played by Elizabeth Russell, who we have mentioned a few times before now, and though her part in this film is very small, she makes as much of an impact here as she did in the earlier Cat People, in which she played the supposed Catwoman who scares Irina by greeting her. From here, the film becomes preoccupied with its themes of death and isolation, as we follow Mary to the Missing Persons Bureau and are greeted by a tracking shot of other people desperately looking for their loved ones, including an old man who has wandered off into the cold. Loneliness and despair are all around us, the film seems to be saying, and Jacqueline is just one of many people who disappear without trace. After an encounter with the ambulance-chasing detective, Mr. August, Mary then heads to the morgue, above which hangs the legend, "He calleth all the children by their name," another of Lewton's additions to the script, which highlights the inevitability of death. As I said at the beginning, this is, without a doubt, the most doom-laden of the Lewton movies. Advised by the morgue that a man called Gregory Ward has also been looking for Jacqueline, Mary visits his office. We later learn that he is Jacqueline's husband, though the loveless state of their relationship suggests that this is not the most conventional of marriages, something that viewers have also pointed out as another clue to the film's queer subtext. It is Ward who reveals the secret of the room in the Dante restaurant, telling Mary that he was the one who helped Jacqueline secure the space in the first place. Quote, "Your sister had a feeling about life that it wasn't worth living unless one could end it. That room makes her happy in some strange way that I couldn't understand. She lived in a world of her own fancy, and she didn't always tell the truth. I'm afraid she didn't really know what the truth was." End quote. After this, Ward takes Mary to dinner and then drops her off at her hotel. And then, rather surprisingly, he tries to dissuade her from searching for Jacqueline any further, and also starts to put the moves on her, saying, quote, "You can't make it your life's work looking for Jacqueline. You'll have to do some other things and live your own life. Get some enjoyment out of life. I hope you'll let me help you." End quote. This is either an indicator that he has no sensitivity chip whatsoever, or it's just a very clunky piece of writing. But in any case, given that they've only just met and that Mary has only just begun her search, this exchange does strike a rather discordant note. Up to this point, the film has been well shot but somewhat conventional, lacking the noir sensibilities that by this stage had made themselves felt in all three of the previous Lewton pictures. However, all of this is about to change with the first of the film's real set pieces, an investigation into the locked offices of La Sagesse, conducted by Mary and a rather reluctant detective, Irving August. Expertly photographed by regular Lewton cinematographer Nicholas Musuraca, this scene is a masterclass of menace and tension, as the two stand before a corridor leading into darkness, accompanied only by the ominous ticking of a clock. From this, it is quite apparent that Robson learnt a great deal from editing the Jacques Tourneur movies, and though he doesn't quite pull off the scene in the way that his predecessor might have, it's still superbly handled. A particular detail that I like is the shadow of the La Sagesse logo on Mary's back, as she encourages August to walk down the corridor to the locked door at the very end. At this stage, we do not know that the logo represents the Satanic Paladists, but there is definitely a sense that Mary has been marked somehow, the symbol emblazoned across her back as she watches August walk slowly to his doom. La Sagesse, incidentally, is the French word for wisdom, a change from the original name of the company in the script, where it had been called La Jeunesse, or youth. So in one sense, Mary has been marked by the cult, but in another, she has been marked by wisdom, with this scene representing her darkest moment in the film and her transition from innocent to adult. And this is something of which Mary has already been warned by the poet Jason Hogue in the Dante restaurant, when he rather obtusely asks her, quote, "Look into your own heart. Do you really want to find your sister?" End quote. In the world of the seventh victim, the search for knowledge or the search for wisdom leads only to destruction. Detective August is stabbed to death, Jacqueline joins a satanic cult, and Mary's story eventually becomes less of a search for her sister and more of a journey into an absolute heart of darkness. And in a scene deleted from the finished movie, she clearly comes to regret her mission, wishing that Jacqueline was dead so that she could abandon her search and continue more peacefully with her life. Like I said, it's a rather dark film. After the death of August, Robson provides another set piece, this time with Mary in an empty subway car. Distracted by her thoughts and her guilt at the detective's death, Mary has inadvertently travelled to the end of the line and back, and is now right back where she started, at the stop by La Sagesse. A trio of drunken men get into the carriage, two of them propping up the man in the middle, who we soon discover is not a drunk at all, but is instead dead Detective August, being disposed of under the pretense of being heavily inebriated. This is a classic film noir moment, exposing the isolation that can be felt in even populated spaces, as Mary flees into another carriage and attempts to get help from other passengers, who are either unconscious or uncaring. Soon after, we meet a new character, or at least new to this movie, as this is a man we have met before in Lewton's first film, Cat People. This is Dr. Lewis Judd, played once again by Tom Conway, revealing the seventh victim to be set in the same universe, albeit on a different timeline. After all, we've already seen this character die at the end of Cat People, and so this places the setting of the seventh victim sometime before. Unless, of course, there are two Lewis Judds running around Manhattan, which, given the nature of the man, is a rather terrifying thought. In the original story, this character went by a different name, Mr. Siegfried, and was presented as a far more satanic figure, at one point stopping to fix a hole in his shoe with a piece of paper shaped like a cloven hoof. This was later changed to his stumbling over a child's toy and complaining that his cloven hooves had tripped him, and then the scene was eventually cut altogether. There are, though, still hints to the dark aspect of his character, telling Mary that when choosing between two different flights of stairs, he always prefers to take the left, which is, as he reminds her, the sinister side. The decision to rename him Dr. Judd was meant to link the film more explicitly with the success of Cat People, but even if we accept that this story is set in an earlier timeline, there are still some continuity errors. When Gregory Ward's secretary asks for help with her father's drinking, Judd coolly pronounces, quote, "I don't practice anymore. I find it easier to write about mental illness and leave the care to others," end quote. So either Judd gave up practicing, only to commence again before the opening of Cat People, or the Lewton team were hoping that no one would remember that he'd died in the earlier film. At least, though, he's kept his rather supercilious attitude, continuing to tell the secretary rather dryly that, quote, "Dipsomania is rather sordid," end quote. But despite this, Judd here is far more likeable than the character in Cat People, and he's probably my favourite character in the film. Though he starts off as a potential villain, by the midway point our perspective begins to shift, and this is mainly due to his relationship with the poet Jason Hogue. Although this relationship starts off rather rocky, with Judd commenting on Jason's poetry and how he has squandered his talent, as the narrative progresses, they form a friendship out of a growing mutual respect, developing what is, for me, the most satisfying dynamic of the entire story. And far more would have been made of this had several scenes not been cut to allow for a shorter running time. In these, Judd, at the request of Jason, has given the poet's new manuscript to his own publisher, who has rejected it on the grounds that it is a sorry and pathetic failure, leaving Judd to break the news. While part of this narrative remains, a scene in the original screenplay depicted Judd's guilt at having to break this news to the poet, knowing that it will leave him devastated and possibly end his career altogether. And so, while its excision may have made for a smoother narrative flow, I cannot help but feel that, as a result, we lose much of the nuance in their relationship, as well as a greater insight into Judd's character. Jason hasn't written for 10 years, and is now, by his own admission, quote, "a terrible failure, a book clerk by day and a poet by night, not a very good one," end quote. He is also, quite clearly, not going to get the girl. Despite everything that he does to help Mary in her search, he knows that she doesn't love him, and selflessly encourages her to follow her heart. And her heart, rather annoyingly, beats for Gregory Ward, the man who doesn't do half as much as Jason to find his own wife. Eventually, Jason becomes like his hero Cyrano de Bergerac, quote, "unable to have the girl he loves and wooing her for his friend," end quote. But despite this, and his paralysing writer's block, Jason remains optimistic and determined to continue on, forming a friendship with Dr. Judd and eventually condemning the Palladists as, quote, "a poor, wretched group of people who have taken the wrong turning," end quote. His role in the film, then, initially appears to be a counterpoint to the overall nihilism, showing the viewer an opposite path to the despair presented by Jacqueline. This, though, very nearly wasn't the case, as a few cut scenes indicate. We've already mentioned the deleted scene revealing his new poetry to be an abject failure, but there was another scene, actually the original ending, that would have painted the character of Jason in a far more depressing light. In the original screenplay, there was an epilogue after Jacqueline's death, where Mary, Jason, and Gregory meet at the Dante restaurant. Mary and Gregory go off together and leave Jason alone, pitifully standing at the foot of the restaurant's mural of the poet Dante and his love Beatrice, a failure at poetry and a failure in love. This then gives a very different final image of Jason than his climactic attack on the Palladists, and I have to say I'm glad they cut it out. Firstly, because the ending they eventually went with is, in my opinion, one of the greatest endings to a film ever, and secondly, because at least this way, I can still imagine Jason occasionally going out for a martini with his new friend Dr. Judd. Well, at least until Dr. Judd gets killed by a panther woman, anyway. After nearly half the movie's runtime, we finally meet Jacqueline, a woman who has till now only been described by others and who, it can be said, has been stripped of her own voice. Even when we first see her, she has her fingers pressed to her lips in a shushing motion, and, as we later find out, it was in expressing herself to her psychiatrist that she signed her death warrant in the first place. She is played under an iconic wig and fur coat by Jean Brooks, who we last saw in The Leopard Man back in episode 2. As we mentioned in that episode, the Jean Brooks story is a rather tragic one, marred by alcoholism that destroyed her career and also, sadly, eventually her life. This gives her performance as the doomed Jacqueline a far greater resonance in hindsight, but even without this knowledge, her presence is bewitching, a mysterious femme fatale who remains a tragic cipher all the way to the end of the film. She has been described as the film's philosophical centre, with film historian Phil Haberman noting the existential nature of her presence. Quote, "Her life is the very nightmare version of life that Val Lewton portrays in many of his movies. A meaningless existence, trying to find meaning, always failing, and in the end, seeking a sort of peace through death." End quote. And it was Jacqueline's lack of meaning in life that led her to the Palladists, as she sought to, quote, "seize onto something, anything, to bring her happiness." End quote. While we encounter Jacqueline initially through Judd, it is through Jason that we uncover the story of the Palladists. After attending a party with Gregory and Mary, at which Judd is present, Jason goes researching at the public library and finds that both Judd and Mrs. Reddy have been withdrawing the same books. One of these contains details of the Palladists, and importantly their symbol, which also happens to be the trademark of La Sagesse. After this is revealed to Mary, she, rather unwisely, goes back to the beauty company's office to inquire about the logo, which leads to a later frightening confrontation with Mrs. Reddy. This is potentially the first ever shower scene in horror film history, and many have pointed to the possibility of its being the inspiration, visually at least, for the similar scene in Hitchcock's Psycho. As Mary showers in her rented room, Mrs. Reddy appears silhouetted behind the shower curtain, her hat appearing as devil horns, and the viewer is suddenly aware of Mary's vulnerability. From behind the curtain, Mrs. Reddy warns the girl to end her search for her sister, saying ominously, quote, "You don't know what you're doing or what dreadful things you might bring about by looking for your sister. You go back to school." End quote. It's a very tense moment and years ahead of its time. And now we learn the true mystery of the story and why Jacqueline has been in hiding. Searching for something, anything to give her life meaning, she decided to join the Palladists, a group to which she was invited by Mrs. Reddy and to which beautician Frances also belongs. But discovering nothing but unhappiness with the group, she spoke to her psychiatrist, Dr. Judd, to help her find an escape, and in doing so broke the cult's rule of absolute secrecy. And so, as a result, Jacqueline has to die. The Palladists, though, are a rather unusual group of Satanists, or at the very least, an incredibly hypocritical one. Their doctrine is non-violence, and so rather than ending Jacqueline's life themselves, they instead elect to drive her to take her own life. And, as it transpires, they had been keeping Jacqueline captive at La Sagesse until such time as she would do so. It was Jacqueline who stabbed Detective August when he broke into the room in which she was being kept prisoner, her panic and desperation forcing her to lash out in terror. It was Mrs. Reddy who then arranged for members of the cult to dispose of the body via the subway, and now that the group are implicated in a killing that Jacqueline has committed, they are now more determined than ever for her to end her own life. This leads to an incredibly tense sequence in which the Palladists capture and kidnap Jacqueline and encourage her to drink poison. The tension and the horror of this is all far too much for young Frances, who completely breaks, first telling Jacqueline to end it all as she can no longer stand it, before changing her mind, sweeping the poison from her hands and crying, quote, I can't let you die. The only time I was ever happy was when I was working for you." End quote. And the implications here for our queer-coded subtext are, of course, enormous. Told to leave and threatened by the Palladists that they may have decided on non-violence, but they are now likely to change their mind, Jacqueline walks into the night. We now have a superbly shot sequence of light and shadow as Jacqueline is stalked down the street with a figure emerging from a doorway and then grabbing her arm from around a corner. Saved at the last moment by a troupe of actors making their way to a theatre bar, Jacqueline escapes and then runs home to her room above the Dante restaurant. Once inside, she meets Mimi, who is inspired by a similarly named and consumptive character in the opera La Bohème. When Jacqueline, her paranoia at full height, asks who the other is, she is met with the following response. "I'm Mimi. I'm dying. I've been quiet, oh, ever so quiet. I hardly move, yet it keeps coming all the time. Closer and closer. I rest, and yet I'm dying." Jacqueline responds, "And yet you don't want to die. I've always wanted to die. Always." Mimi tells her that she is tired of being afraid and tired of waiting, and then Jacqueline asks her, "Why wait?" To this, Mimi replies, "I'm not going to wait. I'm going to go out, laugh and dance, do all the things I used to do." Jacqueline asks, "And then?" And Mimi replies, "I don't know." And then Jacqueline, very softly and almost with envy, says, "You will die." It's an incredibly poetic exchange, and it's a moment which encapsulates the movie in just a few lines of dialogue. Judd and Jason visit the Palladists once more, and it is here that Jason condemns them as wretched. When challenged by their leader to name one thing that demonstrates that they are wrong, Jason is somewhat stumped until Judd intervenes, chastising them with a line from the Lord's Prayer. And this is another change from the original screenplay, where the entire prayer was originally recited. I have to say that this alteration does lead to a far more successful moment, with the remaining lines being, as Judd points out, a particularly apt philosophy for life and also for the Palladists. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. We then travel back to the rooms above the Dante, where Gregory Ward and Mary are waiting for Jacqueline's return, unaware that she is already downstairs in her own rented room. Gregory and Mary declare their love for each other, while both realizing that it has to go unfulfilled, painting their romance as tragic, as well, of course, as a betrayal of Jacqueline. I'm aware that I haven't said that much about Ward through this episode, and there is a very good reason for that. I can't stand the man. This is no reflection, by the way, on actor Hugh Beaumont, who, fun fact, went on to star in US favourite Leave It to Beaver, but more that he is at once an eminently forgettable and also rather odious character. By the midpoint of the movie, the action, such as it is, has shifted over to Jason and Judd, and their witty interplay and chemistry make them far more compelling viewing than our supposed romantic lead. In addition, Ward is a much older man who starts a relationship with his wife's vulnerable, much younger sister, while his wife is supposedly missing, so he's not the most sympathetic of characters to begin with. Sorry, Mr. Cleaver. From here, we return once again to the corridor just below. Here we see Mimi, dressed in her finery, stepping out for one last night on the town. In the background, we hear the sound of a chair overturning in Jacqueline's room. Mimi, not understanding its significance, heads down the stairs and off into the night. And as she does, we hear the voice of Jean Brooks reciting the John Donne lines from the opening of the movie. I run to death, and death meets me as fast, and all my pleasures are like yesterday. Like I say, in my opinion, one of the greatest endings to a film ever, although admittedly, it's not a very happy one. On its release in August 1943, the critical reception to The Seventh Victim was rather mixed. The New York Daily News said that the film established a sinister atmosphere and had an incredible story. The Philadelphia Inquirer praised Jean Brooks' performance, as well as the rest of the cast, and described the film as eerie, anything but cheery, and noted that, quote, director Mark Robson didn't miss any tricks calculated to send chills down the spine, end quote. The LA Times, meanwhile, noted that, quote, probably hard-boiled mystery fans will be disappointed that none of the horrific rights are disclosed, but there are enough other chills and thrills to make up, end quote. The New York Times, however, were highly critical, saying that the film might make more sense if it was run backwards, while Variety was equally negative, saying, quote, a particularly poor script is the basis for the ills besetting this mystery melodrama. Even the occasional good performance can't offset this minor dealer, end quote. Perhaps because of the complexities of the script, and that it is indeed anything but cheery, The Seventh Victim was not as successful as its predecessors, and some viewers refused to stick it through to the bitter end. One cinema proprietor reported on this, saying, quote, we must have been the eighth victim. Patrons walked out. Business is poor. Some kids wouldn't sit through it, end quote. While another reported, quote, this is, without doubt, the most unsatisfactory picture we have any recollection of, end quote. Bit harsh, in my opinion, but then again, I guess money talks. While The Seventh Victim is now seen as one of the greatest of the Val Lewton pictures, and is certainly one of my favourites, it isn't without its flaws. As you can tell, for a running time of little over an hour, it does attempt to cram in a lot, and it's probably not surprising that at times it is thwarted by the scale of its own ambitions. As I mentioned, several scenes were filmed and then cut from the final edit, and other scenes in the screenplay were cut altogether. And while this may have given the intended shorter running time, it does also mean that there are multiple holes in the plot. But despite the flaws in the narrative, a rather unclear timeline, and a few too many characters, The Seventh Victim is still a triumph of nihilism, if you like that kind of thing. Time Out London has called the film a masterpiece, a brooding melodrama that is half noir and half gothic, while TV Guide praised its haunting, lyrical and overwhelming sense of melancholy and despair. It's certainly one of Val Lewton's most personal films, reflecting a darkness that sat within his very core. As his son, Val Lewton Jr. once said, quote, I think my father was really very pessimistic, and I think that comes out in his films. They may look cheerful and hopeful enough, but I think the real effect behind them was a dark pessimism and hopelessness. This whole dialogue of death, he was obsessed with it. End quote. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, and we go from one missing sister to another. This is Inferno from 1980 and directed Dario Argento, and it stars Leigh McCloskey, Irene Miracle, Eleonora Giorgi, Alida Valli, and Sasha Pitoef. And we are getting into the spoilers very early with this one, so if you have yet to see the movie, please do proceed with all due care and attention. Inferno is the second installment in what is known as Dario Argento's Three Mothers trilogy, and is the follow-up to 1977's Suspiria, a film that we covered back in episode 16, and which had been a huge international success. This success attracted the interest of 20th Century Fox, who would eventually go on to produce Inferno, making it the first time Argento would work with a major US studio since the disastrous relationship with Paramount on the giallo Four Flies on Grey Velvet back in 1971. Although the director was initially very wary about working with another studio after all of his previous issues, the relationship started off rather well, and it initially appeared that the partnership would be a fruitful one. According to the director, quote, Fox seemed to be the first studio to understand a very simple fact, one that other companies finally followed. They were trying to keep up with audiences' taste. Suspiria was a massive worldwide hit. It was original and different, yet audiences loved it. For once, these studios seemed to be siding with their clientele, rather than the old-school critics, who always seemed to be praising the past and condemning anything that rocked the status quo. Audiences around this time seemed to follow their wild instincts more and be totally unpredictable in what they wanted to watch. They didn't care if they were viewed as cultured or intelligent. They just wanted to embrace the unique in movies. It was the shock of the new." End quote. Hearing this, I cannot help but think of what is happening in horror cinema as of the time of recording and what is widely being seen as a renaissance in horror movies. Films like Curry Barker's Obsession and Backrooms from director Kane Parsons are drawing in crowds like never before, with audiences clamouring to hear new voices and see new visions of horror on the big screen. In many ways, this explosion of new talent is reminiscent of the birth of new Hollywood in the late 1960s and early 1970s, with YouTubers like Parsons, Barker, and the Australian Philippou brothers providing a new wave of auteurism in much the same way that the film school grads of the 1970s created the American New Wave. It's certainly an exciting time for horror, proving Argento's theory of the shock of the new. And one can only hope that in their new relationships with the major Hollywood players, these talents are treated far better than Argento was by 20th Century Fox, who, despite promising beginnings, turned the production and distribution of Inferno into a nightmare. Of all of his movies, this is the one that Argento speaks of less frequently, and there are barely 4 pages dedicated to it in his autobiography. He has said that the entire experience of making the film upset him greatly, comparing it to being trapped in a Russian prison camp, which is admittedly no small amount of hyperbole, but I think you get the point. Hollywood, in its infinite wisdom, and as it has done so many times before, decided to back a bold and unconventional talent and then tried to add their own conventional opinions, restricting and diluting the very creativity that had attracted them in the first place. Like I say, one can only hope that Barker, Parsons et al. Fare much better. After Suspiria, Argento decided to put his camera down for a while and instead settled into the role of producer alongside his brother Claudio. And the first film they produced together, that was not the director's own work, was certainly a significant one, George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead, a film that would reignite the zombie subgenre and lead to a wave of imitations, some good and some, quite honestly, rather terrible. It was during the production of this film that Argento found himself in New York, snowed in during what he called one of the worst winters in their history, and began to think of Inferno's story, prompted by the letters that he was writing his children in Rome. At this point, he says, the ideas just came together. As regular listeners will know, I am a huge fan of Argento's early work, but, as they will also know, over the course of this series, we've heard from at least 3 people accounts of their involvement in the creation of some of his films, all of which contradict the directors. We've heard from director Aldo Lado, who claimed that he helped co-write the script for The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and only 2 weeks ago we heard from Dardano Sacchetti and his involvement with the Cat o' Nine Tails. And, perhaps most spectacularly, back in episode 6, we heard from Daria Nicolodi about her central involvement in the creation of Suspiria, inspired by tales of her own grandmother and her love for the English writer Thomas de Quincey. And so, while there is no doubt at all that Argento wrote the screenplay for Inferno himself, there is also no doubt at all that at its heart lie the passions of Daria Nicolodi. Daria Nicolodi, who appears in Inferno as the Countess Elise, was born in 1950 in Florence, to a father who was a lawyer and a mother who was a scholar of ancient languages. But more important perhaps for our purposes is her grandmother, Yvonne Miller, from whom Nicolodi inherited her interest in the esoteric. It was her grandmother who told her the stories that inspired Suspiria, and according to Nicolodi, her grandmother was also a witch herself, saying, quote, "She had the gift of what many call the third eye, although she and I prefer to call it intuition. My grandmother was a very important white witch and an expert in magic. I saw how some small witches and women who were interested in the occult behaved with her. If they said something they shouldn't, she shut them up very smartly. You could tell that she was an unassailable person." End quote. As a child, Nicolodi attended the Swiss German School in Florence, graduating 2 years early before entering the Academy of Dramatic Arts. Here she met theatre director Luca Ronconi, who offered her theatrical debut a year later at the International Theatre Festival of Venice. In the late 1960s, she moved to Rome, where she appeared in a plotless and experimental silent film called Rara, released in 1969. But she would make her official professional screen debut in 1970 in a World War I drama called Uomini Contro. Other small roles followed, and then in 1973 she made her breakthrough in the satirical comedy Property is No Longer a Theft. For this she won the St. Vincent Award for Best New Actress, and was also nominated for Best New Actress at the 1974 NASTRI Awards. A year later, she was cast as the female lead in Dario Argento's giallo masterpiece Deep Red, which would introduce her to her future partner and the father of her daughter Asia, and would also, of course, lead to the creation of Suspiria. As we discussed in our earlier episode, Argento has very much downplayed Nicolodi's involvement in the development of that film, but there is little doubt, in my opinion anyway, that her fingerprints are all over it. And if we accept that this is the case, then her fingerprints are all over Inferno as well, whether she wrote the final screenplay or not. After all, as Argento says himself in his autobiography, quote, "We really had collected a lot of material during the preparation of Suspiria, and the resulting tales were begging to be told." End quote. Given that much of this material came from Nicolodi, one might have thought that she would have been given credit for her contribution to Inferno as well. And why this is not the case is perhaps best explained by her, from an interview given for the book Spaghetti Nightmares, published in 1996. Quote, "Loving Dario and having fought so hard to see my humble but excellent work in Suspiria recognised, I didn't want to live through that experience again. So I said, do as you please. In any case, the story will talk for me because I wrote it." End quote. At the time, this did raise a challenge from the interviewer, who reminded her that it was Argento who wrote the finished screenplay, to which she responded, quote, "Yes, but all the ideas on alchemy and occultism in general belong to my knowledge of fantasy, as well as does much of the romanticism present in the film. You only need to consider that the story's lead character is a poetess." End quote. Argento, of course, has a slightly different story, saying that both Suspiria and Inferno, quote, "came from the fact that I loved the Thomas de Quincey essay Lavia and Our Ladies of Sorrow, and I wanted to develop the idea of the three mothers, the origin of all sorrow and pain." End quote. So, as we've now seen multiple times, the actual truth behind this film's inception lies on somewhat murky ground. What we can say for sure, though, is that there are two literary influences at play in Inferno, the first of which is the already mentioned Thomas de Quincey essay Lavia and Our Ladies of Sorrow. We spoke about de Quincey when we discussed Suspiria in episode 16, and also covered the basic concept of this essay, which introduces the three mothers, supernatural beings who spread darkness, sorrow, and despair across the world. It's a rather long essay, so you'll be glad to know I'm not going to read it all here, but I am going to run through some selected passages, and these are the ones which introduce the three mothers to the world. Quote, "Three sisters they are, of one mysterious household, and their paths are wide apart, but of their dominion there is no end. The eldest of the three is named Mater Lacrimarum, Our Lady of Tears. She it is that night and day raves and moans, calling for vanished faces. The second sister is called Mater Suspiriorum, Our Lady of Sighs. She weeps not, she groans not, but she sighs inaudibly at intervals. Hers is the meekness that belongs to the hopeless. But the third sister, who is also the youngest, hush, whisper while we talk of her. Her kingdom is not large, or else no flesh should live. But within that kingdom all power is hers, and her name is Mater Tenebrarum, Our Lady of Darkness." End quote. This essay provides the basis for both Suspiria and Inferno, though it is only in this second of the trilogy that this becomes clear, as illustrated by an opening credits voiceover, in much the same way that Suspiria begins with a similar narrative device. But while Suspiria's opening sits very much within the once upon a time of fairy tales, Inferno takes a different route, with the words being spoken from the text of a book supposedly written by a missing alchemist. Quote, "I do not know what price I shall have to pay for breaking what we alchemists call silentium. The life experiences of our colleagues should teach us not to upset laymen by imposing our knowledge upon them. I, Varelli, an architect living in London, met the three mothers and designed and built for them 3 dwelling places, one in Rome, one in New York, and the third in Freiburg, Germany. I failed to discover, until too late, that from these 3 locations, the 3 mothers rule the world with sorrow, tears, and darkness. Mater Suspiriorum, the mother of sighs and the oldest of the 3, lives at Freiburg. Mater Lacrimarum, the mother of tears and the most beautiful of the sisters, holds rule in Rome. Mater Tenebrarum, the mother of darkness, who is the youngest and the cruelest of the 3, controls New York." End quote. So, although we didn't know it at the time, we have already met the oldest of the 3 sisters, Mater Suspiriorum, the witch living in the cellar of the dance academy in Suspiria. Inferno will tell us the story of the youngest and the cruelest, Mater Tenebrarum, and the third of the trilogy, released very late in the day in 2007, tells the story of the Mother of Tears. I'm going to be honest here, I absolutely loathe the film Mother of Tears, and so just as a heads up, I am never going to discuss it on this podcast, other than this brief mention right now, and if you've seen it, you probably understand why. But while I am having a bit of a grumble, I would like to express my slight frustration at the titling of these films. Given that the first film about Mater Suspiriorum was called Suspiria, one might reasonably have expected this film about Mater Tenebrarum to be called Tenebrae, but it isn't, it's called Inferno. Ironically though, as his next movie, Argento did indeed make a film called Tenebrae, but this isn't about the 3 mothers at all, and is instead a non-supernatural giallo. I don't know why he chose to do this, it's something that I find quite bewildering, but then again, I guess Argento isn't exactly a great friend of logic in both his storytelling and, apparently, in the titling of his films. The clue to the second literary influence in the film can be found in the book being read as the story begins, The 3 Mothers by the architect and alchemist Varelli. While both the book and its author are fictional concepts created for the movie, the character of the alchemist was in fact based on a real person, although, as it turns out, he may actually have been fictional as well. This is the alchemist Fulcanelli, a figure from French occult literature who was purported to have written 2 books published around his supposed disappearance in 1926. The reason that I use the words purported and supposed are because it is likely that Fulcanelli didn't exist at all, and that the name was a pseudonym used by a small French occult and alchemical circle who then mythologized many of the legends about him. And these include that he knew major scientific and political figures, that he twice transformed base metals into gold, and that, even after his disappearance, he re-emerged to warn writer Jacques Bergier of the dangers of nuclear war. This last account was recalled by Bergier in his book The Morning of the Magicians, which was published in 1960 and which first brought the name of Fulcanelli to a wider audience. An international bestseller that found great favour with the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s, this book was described by its authors, Bergier and Louis Puel, as a work of fantastic realism, and espoused many of the ideas that we find in popular culture today. These include occult activity supposedly conducted by the Nazis during World War II, ufology, and of course alchemy. And following its publication, the name Fulcanelli began to appear in popular culture in one form or another. As well as inspiring Varelli and Inferno, we also hear the name in Kronos, the debut feature from Guillermo del Toro, and The Church from Italian director Michele Soave. As to who Fulcanelli really was, we will likely never know. There are several contenders for the role, and it is entirely possible that the name, which stems from Vulcan, the Roman god of fire, and El, the Canaanite name for God, was used by more than one person. But the chief suspects, if you will, are as follows. First, and considered to be the most likely, is a man called Jean-Julien Champagne, an artist who illustrated the two books Fulcanelli is reputed to have written, The Mystery of Cathedrals, published in 1926, and Dwellings of the Philosophers, published in 1929. The second is a man called Pierre Dujol, who is often proposed as the ideological source behind the writings, with supporters of this theory suggesting that he created the text, while Champagne acted as the illustrator and the man who pulled the whole thing together. There is also a man called Eugene Cancelier, who wrote the prefaces to the books and who presented himself as Fulcanelli's disciple and student. And finally, there is René Schwaller de Libich, who had been working on material that was very similar to that published in the first of Fulcanelli's books, The Mystery of the Cathedrals. As I say, it is unlikely that we will ever really know the truth, though the smart money seems to be on Jean-Julien Champagne as the central force. As to whether Fulcanelli was created as a mask to protect those revealing true alchemical secrets, or if, much as with palladism, it was all an elaborate hoax, I will leave entirely down to you. But regardless of where the truth lies, the influence of Fulcanelli's ideas on the counterculture of the 1960s and beyond is really quite phenomenal. It's via the myth of Fulcanelli that we get our modern idea of alchemy as an encoded tradition, with his work suggesting that cathedrals and Gothic old buildings contain hidden secrets and messages within their architecture. And this is something that we see today in many works of fiction, including the truly horrifying books of Dan Brown. And this theory is in fact quoted by the bookseller Kazanian in Inferno, where he describes several different locations as being houses of the damned. According to Daria Nicolodi, quote, I studied books on all the dwellings conceived by Fulcanelli. Some of these, such as the Villa of the Salamanders, the Palace of Peacocks in Brussels, and the Villa of Monsters in Bulgaria, are explicitly named in the dialogues. End quote. Inferno, then, is based more on alchemy than on fairy tales, although Argento has said that the moment where Sarah pricks her finger on a taxi door is a reference to Sleeping Beauty. Of the alchemical influences, Argento has said, quote, the whole story is full of enigmas, most of which remain unresolved, and some of which do have an alchemical interpretation as a solution, which is not, however, provided to the viewer. End quote. He's also called the film the most mysterious project of his career, written like a madman in a New York hotel room in the dead of winter, while he swapped letters with his daughters in Rome, something which inspired the plot device of the letter exchange between Rose Elliott and her brother Mark. He says that while it is always difficult to explain what his films are about, and that he likes to leave that for others to do, in Inferno it is truer than in most of his other works, saying, quote, it's as if there's a set of events that slip into one another. In the course of the story, the characters go in one direction, and then suddenly the viewer realizes that what they thought was the lead character is a secondary figure, and that the story is veering off before their eyes. End quote. This has led to some people calling the film incoherent, particularly when compared with the relative simplicity of Suspiria, and among fans there is often much debate as to which is the better of the two. But while personally I find Suspiria to be a far more satisfying overall experience, there is certainly much to be said for the labyrinthine narrative that Argento provides for Inferno, even if, in my opinion, the first half of the film is much stronger than the second. Inferno begins with Rose Elliott, who is living in a rather fabulous Art Deco apartment building in New York. Reading from the book The Three Mothers by Varelli, Rose begins to suspect that this building, illustrated in the book, is the home of the Mother of Darkness, something that can be established by 3 clues, or keys. Quote, the land upon which the 3 houses have been constructed will eventually become deathly and plague-ridden, so much so that the area all around will reek horribly. And that is the first key to the mother's secret, truly the primary key. The second key to the poisonous secret of the 3 sisters is hidden in the cellar under their houses. There you can find both the picture and the name of the sister living in that house. This is the location of the second key. The third key can be found under the soles of your shoes. There is the third key. End quote. This is setting us up for an esoteric treasure hunt, and this is certainly the direction in which the film initially appears to be heading. After writing of her suspicions to her brother Mark, who is a student in Rome, Rose visits the neighbouring bookstore run by Mr. Kazanian, an incredibly unhelpful character played by Sasha Pitoeff. Pitoeff was an actor that Argento had wanted badly for the movie, having been an admirer of his work since seeing him in the art house film Last Year at Marienbad, released in 1961. His presence here has led at least one commentator to erroneously assume that Inferno was inspired by Marienbad, which is blatantly not the case, even though both works have rather elusive narratives and a dreamlike, or in the case of Inferno, nightmarish quality. Kazanian takes the idea of a grumpy old man and kicks it into overdrive, pretending not to know what book Rose is initially talking about, despite having sold it to her, and then mocking her for her belief in its contents. First, he dismisses her claims about the sickly smell surrounding the building, saying that it comes from the cake factory, and then he accuses her of being too susceptible, saying, quote, "Women are usually the worst or the best readers of this stuff. They want so much to believe." End quote. This line is seen by some as an example of Argento's misogyny, something of which he has been accused fairly regularly. But here I suspect that what he is saying is that women are more in tune with their intuitive and creative sides. And this is something that is raised again by a later line of dialogue where a character, actually the Mother of Darkness, suggests that poetry is a pastime especially suited for women. With the clue about the strange sickly smell ringing in our ears, Rose decides to pursue the second key, which, as Varelli has told us, is hidden in the cellar. This leads us to the film's first great set piece, although, to be fair, the first half of this movie is pretty much just one set piece after another. In this one, Rose ventures down into the cellar, and in exploring loses her house keys, which fall from her belt into a puddle. As she reaches down to get them, we see, in a moment that recalls Jean Cocteau, that her arm disappears completely into the water, and that the puddle is seemingly bottomless. Desperate to retrieve her keys, she then submerges herself in the water, the surface of which hides an enormous and flooded sub-basement ballroom. Like the room full of razor wire in Suspiria, the presence of a flooded ballroom in the basement of a New York apartment block makes absolutely no logical sense whatsoever and pushes the film into the world of the dream, a thematic conceit that Argento has called central to the movie, saying, quote, "The dream is a dominant element of the whole film. One only has to think of the sequence that takes place completely underwater. According to many, it's the most terrifying scene I've ever directed. In order to recover a lost object, a girl lowers herself into a hole full of water. But there really is everything in there. A whole submerged room with furniture, pictures, and doors. This is a typical dream sequence, but things become really interesting when a partly putrefied body appears. The girl screams, her mouth fills with water, and the more she frets, the more oxygen she uses up. She doesn't manage to break the surface, she hits her head, and then uses her bare feet to try to push away the floating body." End quote. It's an incredibly staged sequence, and some sources have erroneously claimed that it was directed by the great Mario Bava. However, this was not the case. Although Bava did create special effects for Inferno, including the lunar eclipse and many of the miniatures, this scene was instead filmed in a water tank, live, by cinematographer Gian Lorenzo Battaglia. So to achieve this sequence, Argento needed an actor who could not only swim, but who also had an incredible lung capacity. In his autobiography, he says that during casting, one of the first questions he asked was, "How long can you cope underwater?" And if the answer wasn't convincing, he would tell the candidate to leave, saying, "This isn't for you, you'll just get yourself killed." In an interview with Alan Jones, Argento has said that the casting process was, quote, "a nightmare. Everyone had to be okayed by Fox, and the two leads took ages to find because the studio couldn't make up their mind. All these young, expectant actors were filing into my office waiting for my decision based on endless memos from head office. In the end, we picked Irene Miracle because she had won acclaim in Midnight Express in 1978. End quote. According to Argento's biography, though, there was another reason that Miracle was chosen. She had been a competitive swimmer as a child, and as such she, quote, swam amazingly well and made beautiful expressions underwater, never giving the impression of being under stress, end quote. In the past, when I was younger and rather unwise, I have attempted to introduce fans of more linear narratives to this movie, and each time the ballroom sequence is met with snorts of derision due to its surreal and illogical nature. This is something that I very quickly learned never to do again, though to be fair, such reactions are still rather surprising, as it is quite clear from the opening of this movie that Inferno really isn't playing in the real world. It certainly can't be described as naturalistic, lit as it is with expressionist tones of violet, raspberry and periwinkle blue, and populated by actors who, much as in Suspiria, were told to act as if they were young children. And while it may not have the same fairy tale narrative of Suspiria, the rules of fairy tale logic still apply. Why is there a flooded ballroom in the cellar? Because there is one. How does the Mother of Tears in Rome know that Mark has received a letter from Rose? Because she just does. And why is the book The Three Mothers suddenly behind Sarah when she visits the library? Because it just is, possibly spoken into existence at the very second that Sarah mentions its title. As I say, Inferno really isn't a film for fans of strict logic and linear storytelling, but then again, I don't really know what those people would be doing watching Argento in the first place, unless of course they're being forced to watch it by someone like me. And speaking of the Mother of Tears, we now move from New York to her city of Rome, and are introduced to our hero, Mark Elliott, played by Leigh McCloskey. He had already made a name for himself on US TV in the miniseries Rich Man, Poor Man, and also in numerous daytime soaps. Much like Irene Miracle, he was cast to give the film a more international and US-centric appeal, and also to offset the largely European cast chosen to play the other characters. Shortly after filming Inferno, he would break into international fame with his role as Mitch Cooper in the hugely successful evening soap opera Dallas. But he was also a very keen and talented artist, focusing, interestingly enough, on the spiritual and the esoteric. In 1981, just 1 year after Inferno and international TV stardom, he and his wife purchased a home in Malibu called Ollander. After this, and according to his website, quote, he opened his home and studio to the public, hosting theosophical study groups every Tuesday evening for 25 years. They were balanced with other discussion book groups on Thursdays to explore Western inner traditions, alchemy, mystical Christianity, Kabbalah, Tarot, Jung, Joseph Campbell, Aldous Huxley, Jacob Boehme, Robert Flood, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Henry Miller, and George Bataille. No mention of Fulcanelli, but I assume he's in there somewhere. Still working as an actor and an artist, he has created tarot decks, paintings, and books, including spending 3 decades creating 3 books that he bound himself. He also created a hand-painted grimoire for the movie Shadow of the Vampire, which, while not being used in the final cut of the movie, still managed to go on tour with the Rolling Stones. So with this in mind, it's hard to think of a man more suited to play the lead in a somewhat opaque film about supernatural beings and alchemy. We are introduced to him in a music class, as Mark is a musicologist, something that the Mother of Darkness, in her human disguise, amusingly later confuses with toxicology. Sitting with his girlfriend Sarah, played by Eleonora Giorgi, he attempts to read the letter sent by Rose, but is distracted from his task by a cat-stroking woman sitting a few rows in front. This character, played by Anaya Peroni, is taken by many to be the Mother of Tears, though Daria Nicolodi would later say that this was not the case and that this person is a witch. But given that we know Rome to be the home of the Third Mother, I have to say I prefer to go with that interpretation. Accompanied by the sounds of the Vapensiero chorus from Verdi's Nabucco, the camera cuts between she and the easily distracted Mark, synced in perfect timing with the opera and essentially creating a set piece out of nothing more than 2 students exchanging glances. And I have to say, over and above the mayhem, this is my favourite scene in the movie, enlivened by the captivating beauty of Peroni staring intently beyond the camera as a sudden gust of wind invades the classroom. This rather out-of-nowhere appearance of the wind is another reference to the film's theme of alchemy, showcasing the symbolic use of the major elements of air, here in the classroom, water in the ballroom, and fire at the film's climax. The only thing missing, really, is earth, though one could argue that this is represented by Mark's journey deep into the cellar of the New York apartment towards the film's climax. Leaving the class in a hurry to pursue the mother of tears, Mark seemingly forgets all about Sarah, and more importantly his letter, which Sarah duly picks up to return. However, unfortunately for her, she decides to read it herself, which is a gross invasion of privacy when you come to think about it. Driven across Rome in a taxi by the same cab driver that drops Susie off at the beginning of Suspiria, she suddenly changes her mind about her destination and decides instead to visit the library, while noting that the air is suddenly filled with a strange smell, sickly sweet. After pricking her finger, a la Sleeping Beauty, Sarah enters the library, allowing Argento to demonstrate a recurring visual motif in his films, a parting of red curtains that we also see in Four Flies on Grey Velvet, Deep Red, and Opera, and which here seems to signify the departure from one realm into another. After a brief glimpse of a menacing student sitting studying, Sarah finds the Three Mothers book conveniently, or magically, sitting on a shelf just behind her, and decides to take it away with her as the library rings its closing bell. So far, Sarah is a snoop and a thief, and she also has a terrible sense of direction, becoming lost in the basement of the library and encouraging a very strange figure as she tries to find the way out. Logic would tell us that this is a bookbinder, restoring old manuscripts to their original state. After all, what else would someone like this be doing in the basement of a library? But the burning cauldrons and glass bottles have another explanation, one perhaps more suited to the film's inspiration, and that is that this figure is in fact an alchemist, beavering away at some experiment or another in much the same way as Varelli and Fulcanelli before him. After the alchemist attacks Sarah and reclaims the book, there is a chase sequence, and she temporarily gets caught on a rather ornate door handle. This idea of being trapped by our own surroundings is a common theme in many of Argento's movies, most notably The Bird with the Crystal Plumage and Tenebrae, which feature characters trapped by sliding doors and artworks, suggesting a world where even the most mundane objects may turn against us. Managing to free herself, Sarah makes her way home to her apartment, asking a neighbour to stay with her as she waits for Mark, who she telephones. Sadly for her neighbour, though, his kindness has marked him for death, as the two are both violently murdered to the strains of Verdi's Va Pensiero. By now, we are nearly halfway through the movie, and we've only just reached our first murder, which is in sharp contrast to Suspiria, where we had two in the first 15 minutes. However, it has to be said, this one is more than worth the wait. After a very fine build-up, the lights go out in Sarah's apartment, and accompanied by the Verdi Va Pensiero chorus, we are given a demonstration of Argento's quite literally operatic approach to violence. It may lack the knife-piercing-the-heart moment of its predecessor, but we do have a knife plunge noisily into Sarah's spine, just before she falls forward through a curtain at the feet of the just-now-arriving Mark. Moreover, as if to make up for the lengthy journey to get here, Argento follows this with another set piece and another killing, this time that of Rose, in a beautifully staged sequence that follows her as she makes her way through the hidden chambers of her building. And much like with our cab driver, here there is another reference to Suspiria, with a pair of cat's eyes gleaming in the darkness, a pointed reference to the first murder in that film. Sadly though, for me at least, it is from this point that the film starts to lose its impetus, and once Mark arrives in New York, the meanderings of the plot become a bit distracting. After a relatively controlled, if completely bonkers, first 50 minutes, we are suddenly introduced to a plethora of new characters, all of whom are occupants of the apartment building, and therefore potential suspects or witnesses to Rose's disappearance. We have Elise, the neighbour, played by Daria Nicolodi, who clearly likes to trauma dump at the first point of meeting. There is a nurse and her mute wheelchair-bound patient, played respectively by Veronica Lazar and Fyodor Chaliapan. There is Carol, the caretaker, played by Suspiria's Elida Valli, and there's also a butler named John, played by Leopoldo Mastaloni. In my opinion, it's just too many characters to introduce midway through a movie, and the second half starts to become rather shapeless as a result. This is not to say, though, that from this point there is nothing of interest. Daria Nicolodi's appearance certainly livens up this part of the film, and the character of Elise is a very interesting one, weak and sickly, addicted to drugs, and regularly abandoned by her rich husband. It is through her that Mark learns about the three mothers, and her scenes also provide clues to the nature of the building that Varelli designed, full of weird secrets, including the ability to hear conversations in other rooms. But though her death is impressively handled, particularly with the close-ups of turning lock mechanisms as she tries to escape, we really don't know enough about the character to truly care. Unlike Sarah in Suspiria, whose death means something to the viewer, here Elise seems little more than cannon fodder, or in this case, kitty fodder. Carol and John are clearly intended to serve as red herrings, particularly given Valli's previous role as Miss Tanner in Suspiria, but their deaths towards the end of the film are also rather meaningless. The only death that really matters to the narrative is that of the bookseller Kazanian, which is used not just to dispose of his meddling, but also to show that the agents of darkness are everywhere. Deciding to drown some of the cats that have been bothering him, he secures them in a sack and makes his way to the lake at Central Park to do just that. And yes, he really deserves what happens next. Once there, he stumbles on his crutches and lands in the water, at which point New York is visited by the lunar eclipse provided by Mario Bava. As Kazanian struggles in the water, he is attacked by a swarm of rats and begins to scream for help. We see a vendor from a hot dog van across the park leap from his vehicle to race to him, and then we have an intercutting between Kazanian's struggles and his potential saviour sprinting to his aid. But at the very last minute, Argento turns the tables and reveals the vendor to not be a hero, but instead an agent of Mater Tenebrarum, and he finishes off the bookseller with a blow from a butcher knife. It's a very well-staged sequence, particularly in the intercutting between victim and potential rescuer, but sadly it's let down by some rather shoddy effects work and a rather poor performance from Sasha Pitoeff. As Argento explained to writer Alan Jones, quote, "Mario Bava and I hated how small the rats were we had been provided with by a local pet store. So we did some research and found out that there was this breed known as the Chinese fighting rat or something similar. They were big, ugly and vicious and had small noses. We decided to import 1,500 of this rodent species from Asia. They arrived just in time for the scene where French actor Sasha Pitoeff was going to be attacked by them. I'll never forget the day at De Paolis Studios where we filmed the inserts. There was Mario, Lamberto and me all holding the rats by their tails between our fingers, ready to let them drop on Pitoeff's body. But Pitoeff wouldn't respond in the way you would normally react to having rats crawl all over you. After an hour of trying to get him to do something, anything, Lamberto suddenly told everyone to leave the set, including me. 5 minutes later, we all heard this horrible scream, and Lamberto emerged from the soundstage saying, "It's done, everything is fine." He refused to tell us what he did to Pitoeff to get that reaction, and I thought it was best not to ask. End quote. Argento went on to say that he later learned some of his imported rats escaped and bred with those at the studio, creating a superspecies. This group of rats caused a significant amount of disruption to multiple movies in the subsequent years, until the studio staff eventually managed to have them eradicated, a process that took them and the exterminators several years. But despite Lamberto Bava's actions, whatever they were, the rat sequence just doesn't work at all, and it contains some of the more questionable effects of the movie, but these certainly aren't the worst. That title is sadly saved for the figure of death that appears at the climax, breaking through a mirror as the Mother of Darkness attempts to steal Mark away forever. By this stage, Mark has worked out the secret of the third key. Hidden beneath the soles of his shoes is a network of secret passages throughout the building. These are marked out in the symbols and the gargoyles added to the exterior of the building by Varelli, and this is another reference to Fulcanelli's Secrets of Cathedrals. Lowering himself in, Mark makes his way to the heart of the building, where it is revealed that the old man in the wheelchair is the architect and alchemist Varelli, while the being posing as his nurse is Mater Tenebrarum, the Mother of Darkness. Speaking through an electronic device attached to his vocal cords, Varelli tells Mark, quote, "I built the houses for the three mothers, which became their eyes and ears, and then I buried myself here. This building has become my body, its bricks my cells, its passageways my veins, and its horror my very heart." End quote. After dodging a murder attempt from Varelli, during which Varelli himself dies, Mark finally confronts Mater Tenebrarum, played by Veronica Lazar. Rather unexpectedly, she seems a little resigned to the destruction of her house, saying, "It's on fire, it's all going to burn down, just like before," referring to the blaze at the end of Suspiria, before telling Mark his journey has come to an end. Quote, "Everything around you will become dark, and someone will take your hand. You'll be pleased, not unhappy. You'll enjoy moments of incredible brightness. You think it's magic? No, I'm not a magician. Now we have to hurry, because we still have to pass through a number of strange phases, and you'll change. You were looking for me, just like your sister. This is what you wanted." End quote. At this point, she reveals that she and her two sisters are in fact death incarnate, a speech punctuated by the appearance of a robed skeleton crashing through a mirror. Of this, Argento has said, quote, "After the Witches of Suspiria, I thought that in order to express evil in even greater depth, the only option at my disposal was to put death itself on the screen. No one is above her." End quote. But if this was his intent, then sadly the execution fails somewhat miserably, with the climactic speech completely let down by what appears to be an oversized Halloween costume, and I defy any Argento fan to tell me otherwise. Even Daria Nicolodi admitted that this was a huge disappointment, saying, quote, "Unfortunately, not all the effects were done by Mario Bava, such as death, for example. The technical special effects crew were not exactly up to standard." End quote. Which, if we're honest, is putting it mildly. But despite its flaws, there is much in Inferno that I love. Although it is not shot on the same obsolete Technicolor stock that was used for Suspiria, it is equally as beautiful as its predecessor, with the lighting and the imagery popping off the screen. As Argento has said, it is full of strange symbols, including the fact that 3 of the main victims all break glass in some way shortly before their deaths. Sarah knocks a glass ashtray over in her apartment, Rose breaks a glass door handle, and Kazanian breaks an ornament in his bookshop. I've got no idea what any of that means, by the way, but it's too much of a coincidence for it to mean nothing at all. This is all accompanied by an excellent score from Keith Emerson from the progressive rock band Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which alternates between a gentle piano motif to a prog rock version of Verdi that emulates the bumpiness of a taxi travelling across Rome. There is also an electronic mass for the 3 mothers that, under Argento's instruction, deliberately evokes Karloff's Carmina Burana. And the film also has some surprisingly witty and surreal dialogue, with one doomed victim confusing the 3 mothers for a trio of singers, snidey asides about poetry, and an incredibly strange reference to heart medicine that is both childlike and menacing at the same time. But as I mentioned earlier, the production was not a happy one, with studio interference frustrating Argento throughout, and this was compounded by some changes at Fox head office. As Argento later said, quote, "It's a very long story with Fox and what they did to Inferno. Halfway through shooting the picture, the management at Fox changed, and the new management boycotted all the films that were being produced by the previous board. Not only Inferno, but several others. They didn't want anything to do with them." End quote. This is a similar situation to that which we heard about when discussing The Empty Man back in episode 41, and much as in that case, the change of management significantly impacted distribution. Although Inferno was released in Italy in February 1980, and in the UK and Australia in September and November respectively, the film didn't receive a theatrical release in the US until much later. As Argento himself said, anyone outside of Italy was lucky to see the film at all, and even then, it was far less well received in his homeland than his previous films. And critics in countries where it was released were not positive, with The Guardian in the UK calling it a badly dubbed sequel, and going on to say that it had an idiotic narrative and a risible script, calling it, quote, a shambles of a film in all senses, end quote. In 1986, Inferno was eventually released theatrically in the US, but only for 1 week as part of a double bill with The Shining, and once again the critics were less than kind. Variety called it, quote, a lavish, no-holds-barred witch story whose lack of both logic and technical ability are submerged in the sheer energy of the telling, end quote, going on to say that Argento's style was cheaply vulgar and full of clumsy shots that couldn't be edited together. But while I may take their point about lack of logic and the Guardian's point about poor dubbing, I do draw the line at the critique of the technical skills. If nothing else, this film is an exercise in technical brilliance, and so I would suggest that perhaps these reviewers sit more firmly in the camp belonging to my linear cinema-loving friends than they do in mine. Even today, the debate about its merits compared with its flaws still continues, with Kim Newman calling it Argento's masterpiece and the most underrated horror of the 1980s, while others are far less complimentary. As we mentioned earlier, even Argento has called this the most mystifying film he ever made, and so it's not going to satisfy everyone. For me, it is rather a curate's egg, with one half exceptional and the other half less so. But even then, there are elements of that second half that I still rather enjoy, as long as I remember to prepare myself for the Halloween costumed figure of death that appears at the end. In between the making of 1975's Deep Red and the making of Inferno, Daria Nicolodi took the lead role in Mario Bava's last movie, Shock, which was released in 1977, and which is a film we'll be discussing in a few weeks' time. Following Inferno, she continued her working relationship with Argento with roles in 1982's Tenebrae, 1985's Phenomena, and Opera in 1987. A significant contributor to the world of Italian genre cinema as writer, muse, and performer, she reunited with Argento one last time in 2007 for Mother of Tears, the final chapter of the Three Mothers trilogy, which starred their daughter Asia in the lead role. She died in November 2020 at the age of 70. The Seventh Victim and Inferno both follow siblings searching for their missing sisters in New York City, finding instead satanic cults and supernatural beings, as well as, according to some critics, some rather incoherent screenplays. Both were released as follow-ups to far more successful films, and both were considered, at the time, to be something of a disappointment. The first because audiences didn't really take to it, and the second because audiences didn't really get to see it. Both are also partly inspired by literary enigmas, the Taxil hoax on the one hand, and the fictionalized alchemist Fulcanelli on the other, works which still have an impact on occult studies today. One film might be film noir, and the other far more surreal, but together they suggest that, whether it's a beautician at a local beauty parlour or a hot dog seller in Central Park, the agents of darkness are always closer than we might think. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and please also consider sharing this episode with any horror-loving friends. You can also contact the show via email at thehorrordoublebill@gmail.com or follow our Instagram at thehorrordouble. Next week, unfortunately, I have a rather crazy week ahead of me, and so sadly I am going to have to take another week off. I do hate to keep doing this, but I would rather take a short break than try to rush something out and deliver something that I'm less than happy with. So huge apologies, and I will try not to do it too often. But I will be back on Sunday the 21st, when we will be shifting from the East Coast to the West Coast and exploring two horrors of Hollywood and the silver screen. First up, we have the excellent Fade to Black from 1980. This was written and directed by Vernon Zimmerman and stars Dennis Christopher, Eve Brent, Linda Kerridge, and a very early role for Mickey Rourke. And if, like me, you're a bit of a geek for vintage Hollywood, then this is the horror film for you. Then we jump forward to 2014 and Starry Eyes, a film partly funded through Kickstarter. This was written and directed by Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmeyer and stars Alexandra Esso, Amanda Fuller, Noah Sagan, and Fabienne Therese. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if they're not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. So I'll be back on Sunday the 21st for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening and have a really great 2 weeks. Goodbye.